Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 6 of our Providing Evidence for TAE currency. Today, we're running TAEASS502, Design and Develop Assessment Tools. Once again, John Price is our presenter today, and Kerry Buttery will be assisting him with the webinar today. So John brings over 40 years' experience in education and training to this webinar. In that time, he has facilitated a range of national and international workshops covering topics such as delivery and assessment, validation, RPL, risk management, auditing, leadership and interpersonal skill development. He has delivered all of the Certificate for Training and Assessment qualifications from the initial 1998 BSZ through to the TAE 40110, and is here today to present Session 6 of Belg Training's latest series of webinars. For those of you who are new to our webinar platform this morning, I will just quickly run through the control panel with you and how to get the most out of your session. So your control panel is located on the right-hand side of your screen and is collapsible via the red arrow. It's here that you're also able to raise your hands to ask or answer any questions, just like in a real training environment. You are given two audio options when logging on to any webinar. The first is via telephone. Just dial the number displayed on your screen, followed by your access code and your audio PIN. And the second audio option we have today is via mic and speakers. You're able to communicate via the chat window. It's here that we encourage you to type any questions or comments that you do have throughout the duration of the webinar. They will come through to Kerry and John first before we provide you access with those. Once we have responded to your questions, they will display in a green dialog box like you can see on your screen at the moment. So we'll just do a very quick audio test. Were you able to raise your hands if you could hear, please? Lovely. It looks like you're starting to get your hands up there, which is fabulous. So I'm also going to launch a very quick poll to see who we've got online today. We have the options of CEO, RTO owner, or trainer and assessor. Lovely. All of you are starting to get your votes in there, which is fabulous. So I will just share the results with you now. So we have predominantly all of you are trainers and assessors, with a handful of CEOs and RTO owners as well. So if you do just bear with me for a very quick moment, I will just hand over now to John to begin.
Good morning, everyone. Session 6 seems to be going nice and quick. Beautiful day here in Brisbane. Hopefully you're having such good weather wherever you are as well. It's interesting, isn't it? We've got probably over 100 people attending today, and classically there'll be 100 people in front of me, and I suppose you are in front of me, and I'm trying to picture all of your faces, but I'll still get used to it. I'm starting to enjoy webinars now more than possibly I did when I first started. So it's great to work with you, and it's great for me to see familiar names coming up every week. On the screen in front of you is what we're going to be looking at today. It is interesting when you look at the stats, where we've got probably over 80% of the people attending are trainers and assessors. And Kerry and I were talking about that before the session today, because many of you may have and many of you may not have this particular unit of competency, because it is certainly in the diploma qualification. It's been an elective in the certificate 4. So today, like every week, what we're doing is we're looking at unpacking the units of competency, and particularly one every week. We're going to be looking about how these activities, or the types of activities that a trainer and assessor does, that would demonstrate their currency in this area. We're also going to be making sure that what it does as we go through, it should prompt you to think about any gaps that may exist. For example, when we look at today's session, one of the aspects of this unit is that you needed to have developed 5 assessment tools. So some of us might be working towards that, some of us may have 1 or 2 under our belt, and some of us may have more than that. So it will certainly point to some gaps that we may have, and looking at the types of evidence that can be used to demonstrate our currency. And finally in there, one of the great things, I think it's a great thing we've provided, and certainly I use it and will be using it, particularly for RPL purposes, is that there's a pro forma provided for you to document your currency in. We're getting good feedback about that. This is the 6th session now, so by now you're building up quite a portfolio of these pro formas, which will certainly assist you in demonstrating your currency. So welcome to session 6. And in particular, don't forget there's a couple of other things you'll get. Some of you may have remembered the session where Matthew and myself, my son Matthew and myself, did 5 sessions on TAE currency. And those 5 sessions will be provided to you. The videos of those 5 sessions will be provided to you as part of this program. And just watching those videos and listening to what's going on as Matthew and I discuss what currency is about actually also provides evidence for any of the aspects of TAE that you're working through at the moment. So a little bit of an extra resource for you there. So the first thing is we need to talk about what do I already do to maintain my currency in this particular unit. Now, as I said before, it's not a unit that all of us may have, and I'll ask you that question soon. But, for example, this has always been an elective in this particular qualification, the TAE 40110. It was always an elective in that. And some of you may have picked it up as an elective. So some of you are maintaining currency, and some of you may need to actually build up some content experience in this area, and certainly identify what you might need more of. So we start to look at what actual evidence do I have. So the 80-odd% of you who are working in an RTO at the moment have probably started to build up substantial evidence towards this particular unit of competency. But what do I need to keep records of is always a really important thing. And as we go through it today, we'll, as I have with all the other ones, I'll get you to think about how you might be able to use this PD and some of your evidence recordings to support an RPL application. Because, again, if you don't actually hold this unit, we do know that it is a core unit in the new TAE 40116. So we do know that that's a core unit in there now, so we're either going to be maintaining our currency, or you may decide that you could put an application in for RPL for this particular unit. So let's have a look at the application of the unit and what it involves. So what is it actually designed to achieve? Let's have a look at what it says in the application. So when we look at the application, it gives us an idea of what's involved. So design and develop. So we're really starting to think about what tools do we need. So it's not just developing them based on a specification, it's actually designing them. What do I need to pull together to develop this assessment tool? And the interesting thing is it then starts to look at how we gather this evidence, or we collect evidence for not only our summative and maybe RPO, but also our formative aspect of assessment. So when you're going through this, you're thinking about an assessment tool that you're developing that might clearly help you to be able to see how your students are shaping up. How are they forming up? What's going on? You know, quite clearly this tool might be something that assists you in diagnosing whether they are okay with the way the progress is going for the unit, or whether they need to have more support. Maybe it also gets you to look from a formative point of view. Maybe you or I as trainers might need to change in terms of the information we're giving it. So it's good to see formative in there. So often it's not something that we measure in terms of the final assessment, but it certainly allows us to see how they're shaping up. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this particular unit requires evidence of 5 tools. So let's just say 5 of these tools I need to have produced. So let's have a little bit of a look and see, how many of you, if you have produced 5 assessment tools over the past 12 months, tick the yes box if no, the no box, and we'll start to see, again, from the 80% of people who are with us, how many people already have this or have quite clearly the currency for this. Okay, so those figures are starting to build up there. We've got probably 2/3 of people saying that they would have produced 5 assessment tools over the past 12 months, and the other third saying, no, I need to develop assessment tools. And again, that's a really good indication for me, because what it might be showing is that quite clearly what we have is a number of people who may already have this unit of competency and have been using that their skills and their knowledge to actually create these assessment tools. Or for some people, those assessment tools have already been developed for you, and what you're doing, you're using them. So it's really good, particularly the 38% of you. What you're going to get from the session today is the sort of information that you will need for you to start to collect. And don't forget, it's a currency exercise we're going through today. It's not necessarily a training exercise where I'm training you in this particular unit of competency. Well, I am exposing to you to the content of the unit so you can see what you may have to do, particularly if you're going to be putting your hand up for RPL to gain the unit, or for those people who already have the unit to be able to show how you're maintaining your currency in that unit. So a really good mix of people here today. So we're going to start to look at how this unit gets unpacked. And as we've done previously, we start to look at to determine, am I on track when it comes to currency against this unit of competency? And don't forget, from that 62% that we have, you're looking at your currency against something that you already have. So what are you doing that's maintaining the currency? Whereas the other 38% are really thinking about, hey, maybe I don't have this, maybe I've never developed something, so what am I going to have to develop so that I remain on track and not only use that information for my RPL, but also then subsequently use it to maintain my currency. You will remember Pricey's magic mirror. Every session that I've done, I've given you this picture of this mirror, and the whole idea is that you look into this mirror and see if you can see yourself. So Pricey's magic mirror is that you should be able to look in this mirror and see the picture of a competent person. And that's hopefully going to be you. So I look into this mirror and I see myself and think, okay, yes, I do know this unit, and this is what I'm doing to maintain my currency in this unit, so I feel comfortable. But on the right-hand side, we've probably got those 38% of people who look into the mirror and maybe think, well, I've never developed any assessment tools, so this is something I'm going to learn from. There's also something hidden underneath that question mark. So just think what it could be. I'm talking about an assessment tool. What could Pricey in his deviousness have hidden underneath that question mark? Have a think about what it might be. Think about what an assessment tool is. So just type something in. I'll just take this for just a few seconds just to get you a bit of engaged in the chat window. Can you think what might be behind that question mark? I'm trying to wake you all up. Not sure whether I'm succeeding, but I'm trying to wake you all up. Or you're really so excited that I may have to say, okay, let me show you. So what we have behind that is something that I always look for an analogy about, and it's a Swiss Army knife. I think if I was to look back maybe 10 years ago and think about what an assessment tool was, I'd probably think, I'd probably think it was an assessment instrument. So maybe 10 years ago, to me, an assessment tool was the instrument I would use to observe you, or the instrument I would use to test your knowledge. But it's quite clear now that what an assessment tool is. It's a bit like a Swiss Army knife. It's got a whole range of things at all. all fit together within this assessment tool, and we'll look at those in a minute. So let's have a look now at what does a competent person actually do for this unit. As with every week, what I've created for you is a summary of that unit. And what you can see on your screen, there are 6 statements that I believe summarize the unit. From number 1, where you identify the evidence requirements for the assessment tools. Don't forget there are 5 tools we're looking for here. Right through to number 6, where you then make sure you've got all that version control and document control to ensure only the latest versions of the assessment tools are at the point of use. So I've tried to summarize this unit into those 6 steps. And the reason I've done this is really important, because if we look at each of them as a step, all I have to ask myself is that for number 1, for example, identify the evidence requirements for the assessment tools. What am I currently doing to identify the evidence requirements of the assessment tools? So you can see these statements lead us into our currency really easily. And as we work through these, we'll be ticking them off. I'll give you a chance with the bottom 2 to end up putting your activities in. But you know, with every single one of these, not only have I developed this summary, but I've also developed the opportunity to map each of these summary points to the requirements of the unit. So when we tick them all off, we actually also tick off quite clearly how these are mapped to the units as well. So they're all there. You should feel comfortable that when this is being created, there should be nothing in there that's missing. And for those of you who may be going forward with this for an RPL to gather this tool, don't forget all this information we're giving you might be really valuable. So, be on the front foot when you're talking to somebody, to an RTO that might be going to issue this unit to you. Tell them that you've identified the summary, or you've summarized the unit, you've identified how it maps, and then show them the activities that we go through today. I think you'll feel very comfortable with that approach to RPL. So let's have a look at the currency activities that directly relate. So the very first one that I've put in there is the identify the evidence requirements for the assessment tools. So don't forget now what I'm looking at is what does Pricey do? What do I do now to maintain my currency here? So these are the sort of things that I do. I identify, acts and analyze the units of competency and the assessment requirements to make sure that I can clearly identify the evidence that would be needed to demonstrate competency, and ensuring that this evidence complies with the rules of evidence. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm looking for, I'm accessing, I'm interrogating, interpreting the units to make sure I can clearly see what the evidence is. And then what I do, I actually then look at the workplace. Are there any workplace standards, workplace documentation, policies and procedures? Again, including people's work health and safety responsibilities and anything to do with what they do with regard to work health and safety. And then I look at the industry requirements through discussion with industry stakeholders. So that's what Pricey does. I'm not suggesting that's what you do, but that's what I do. And then what I do is I then put that into a list. And what they do, these dot points sit underneath the activities. And in a second, I'll show you how that activities then start to go into the recording instruments. So this is Pricey's, I suppose, vocational currency in this area. This is what I do to maintain my vocational currency. And you'll see how that then goes into the record that I create. So when I'm recording this evidence, each of you will have been given for today's session a recording template. And there's an example of it up in front of you, where those 6 summaries are down on the left-hand side, and the mapping is on the right-hand side. And as I'm going through this, for example, for the first one, what I've done is to show those activities lined up against summary point number 1. So you can see how they're lining up there. I've then indicated the sources of information, where I got this information from. from training.gov, from communication or visits to the workplace. There would have been a series of dates that I would put in there to show when I actually gathered this information. And down at the end there is the sort of evidence I would retain. So I will keep copies of the units of competency with any notations on there about the evidence required. I scratch and I scribble over these units. Sort of I'm using my computer, I highlight them, I put notes in there to myself. I gather relevant workplace policies and procedures, and I keep notes from any discussion with industry. So that's going to be the evidence that I can present if I was going for RPL. So again, I'm reinforcing the RPL for this one because many of you who don't, if you don't have it, the 38% of you don't have this particular unit of competency, you're going to be able to build up a really good set of information that might help you to get it. And at the end, of course, is the mapping against the PCs. So that's for number one. And of course, once I've got number one right, I then start to look at going through the other ones. So we've got 5 to work through together. So again, reminding you that an assessment tool is a little bit more than just the assessment instrument, and we'll see those components soon. So think about it as a Swiss Army knife. So the next component gets me to start to looking at existing tools that we may have. You know when a unit of competency or a qualification is superseded and it's not equivalent, we're going to start from scratch generally with the assessment tool. But often if a unit of competency or a qualification has been superseded and is equivalent, there will already be some assessment tools around. So if that's the occasion for you, you would grab hold of those assessment tools, see where you would need to change, because don't forget, although the outcome is equivalent, the actual mix inside the unit about performance evidence, knowledge evidence, compared to performance or skill requirements and knowledge requirements are different. The PCs may have been altered. The outcome is the same, but the way those assessment tools have been structured is different, but you might be able to use them. So what do I do here? I grab hold of the existing tools. I check them out to make sure if they can or if they can't be met. They can't meet the current requirements. If I can make any amendments, I'll do that. I'll forward them on to either to my team leader or to the RTO manager. So those amendments may be made and the version control applied. That might be me. I might be the one that actually has to make the changes. You're working in a bigger RTO, you may actually identify the changes and then forward them on to somebody else who will actually make the changes for you. But they're the things that I do. And that then ends up as a couple of dot points, which are the activities that I undertake, and those activities then get recorded back into that form that we were looking at before. So again here, where did I get the information? Team leader, they're the relevant dates, they're the tools that I'm going to keep as evidence. So if I've got those existing tools and I've made some scratches and scribbles on there, or I've actually changed them, I will have evidence of those tools having been amended. And at the end, of course, I'll have the PCs and the performance evidence and all the other mapping that I need. So we've done the first one, we've now looked at the second one, and we'll now start to look at the third one. So the next point actually takes it, in the previous point, we actually identified whether there was any need to change them. And if there was, we're now going to modify those tools. Or we're going to develop new assessment tools. And those are going to be developed around the context that we need. So let's have a look at what I do when I'm doing this particular activity. The important thing of here, of course, is that you need to think of at least 5 assessment tools that are required for this particular unit of competency. And if you read at that first bit there, so I needed to have developed or been involved in activities where I've developed, modified or developed new 5 assessment tools. And the interesting thing is that these have to address at least 1 unit of competency. So as soon as you start to think about that, it's unlikely that you'll have an assessment tool. It's unlikely you'll have an assessment tool for a complete unit of competency. You'll more than likely you may have 3 assessment tools for a unit. There might be an assessment tool around observation. There might be an assessment tool that you've developed around knowledge. There might be another assessment tool that you've developed around workplace assessment. And maybe another one that you've developed around a portfolio or an assignment. When you put this together, really do make sure that those 5 assessment tools do address at least 1 unit of competency. So I then identify the tools, I make the changes, and check them against the principles of assessment. And can they gather evidence to meet the rules of evidence? So they're the sort of activities I do. By now, as we're going through this, even if those of you who have never developed maybe an assessment tool, you can start to see it's the core of what we do as assessors. Should be nothing in here which is strange to you. Maybe we don't have much experience of maybe developing them, but you can start to read through this, you start to see there's nothing strange in this. It should fit with me fairly comfortably. Okay, so they're going to look like the list that you have there. There will be the activities that would be recorded in that recording instrument, no different from the other ones. Now, down the bottom of there, it says, see the next slide for details of what needs to be considered when developing these assessment tools. So I'm going to move on to that slide now so you can actually see what sort of things are involved in this. So what we should have coming up here are the main components of an assessment tool. You know, a couple of minutes ago when I admitted to you, when I'm first to admit with anything that I do that maybe I need to change, is that probably a few years ago I thought an assessment tool was an assessment instrument. You think, how could Pricey think that? And maybe some of you felt the same, that maybe an assessment tool wasn't all of these things here, because you start to look at this list here. So it actually covers the requirements, the objectives of the assessment. It actually gets to reflect on the context, the conditions of assessment, the situations in which the assessment will be conducted. So you can start to see this coming together as something which clearly does, and I think is an excellent part. It really does inform the assessor of what's involved in this assessment. So, who the cohort is, what tasks are we going to do, what sort of evidence am I going to gather, what criteria am I going to use to judge the evidence so that I can determine the rules of evidence have been met. Who will collect the evidence? Will it be me? Or will it be collected by a third party? Will it be collected on the job? And then finally, the administration, the recording and the reporting requirements, what policies or procedures do we use? What practical things do we do to record and report this? So you go back to something I talked about earlier, and you can actually see now where that Swiss Army knife has all of those various bits to it that come together to create this assessment tool. So to me, it's like that Swiss Army knife. That's what I remember about it. Whenever I think about an assessment tool, I think about, okay, what are the components? And for those of you who've seen a variety of Swiss Army knives, you can get up to 100 different bits on them, but we're really looking here to say there's probably 9 or 10 components that make up the assessment tool that we use. So Swiss Army knife, don't forget that analogy. So where are we? We've looked at the first 3. We've got 4 more to do. So I'm going to do the next one, and then I'm going to get you to look at the last 2. So in the next one here, we're starting to look now at the range of information that we do need to include in the assessment instrument itself. Because you can imagine if I'm going to be giving you, if you're one of my students and I'm going to be giving you this actual assessment instrument, maybe it's an observation I'm going to conduct. I really need to make sure that both you as the learner and the assessor have enough information to be able to effectively use this assessment instrument. So I need to think about what's going to be in that. So this assessor information is going to include, in this particular tool, the points that you have on the screen there. Why are we doing this? Is there any legislation relevant to it? What equipment and other resources? What are the specific instructions that the students need to know? Instructions on how I will give you feedback if you're one of my students. And also any references to the use of benchmark answers and mapping, so that later on when I'm marking those assessments, I know where the benchmarks are. I'm comfortable that they've been mapped to the unit. And it really goes into the instructions on recording the assessment results, because you may have some different ways of doing that in your RTO. Imagine this is one assessment, maybe from 3 or 4 assessments within the unit. You may have a summary of assessment that covers that unit. So you're going to have probably a different way with the instructions on you. On how you record it need to be there. And then we start to look at the candidate information. So if you're the candidate, if you're the learner, what do you need to know? So what's the purpose of the assessment? Is there an option for RPL? Don't forget, RPL is not just something we offer at the beginning of a course. It's something that might be available to the students all the way through. How long have you got to do the assessment? Is it something that can be done over a couple of weeks? It might be an assignment, or it could be something that you've got an hour to sit down and to finish. And what resources am I going to supply? So there's quite a few things here. Do I need any PPE, or do you need any PPE as a student? What are some of the options for reasonable adjustment that I might consider? You need to know about them. You need to know that it's not just going to be or any option. It's going to be an option that I have to consider that will not in any way affect the rigor of the unit of competency. But you do need to know how results will be provided to you, how feedback will be provided to you, and also the process that you get to provide feedback again. And also, obviously, if there's going to be a reassessment or appeal, you need to be able to have that. So when I'm creating the actual assessment instrument, I need to make sure that you as a candidate know all of that information which is on the screen at least. And the screen before that looked at all of the assessor information that needs to be in that instrument as well, so that, as the assessor, I know how to actually implement that particular assessment instrument. So we're down now, we're down to the last couple of this next one for you to look and get your turn. So this is where you're going to start to chat. So in this particular statement, ensure the assessment instruments, etc. You've got you're going to make sure these assessment tools meet the principles. Assessment instruments developed for the assessment tools meet the principles of assessment, the dimensions of competency, and also have the capacity or the ability to gather evidence so that satisfies the rules of evidence. So, in your chat window there now, start to chat, start to type in the sorts of things, as activities that you would do to make sure that these assessment instruments satisfy the principles of assessment, the dimensions of competency, and can gather the evidence you need. So we're getting some information coming through now. Okay, Carly, yeah, we've got, Kerry's just pointing out to me these things coming through now. So excellent. Carly, what you're going to do there is you're going to validate, and certainly at this stage where we're creating the tools, we're going to validate these tools pre-assessment to make sure they meet the requirements and the principles of assessment and can gather the evidence. And when you talk about moderate there, we know moderation is not part of the requirements of the standards, but it's a great practice to have in place. So you're right, I do exactly the same. I'll validate it, does it meet the requirements of valid, reliable, fair and flexible, and what do my colleagues think? So although I've put it together, that moderation is really important. And yes, and we're seeing there that it's a formal validation process. You do need to keep records of that. You know, we're suggesting here we might test these instruments. Again, if you can do that. Sometimes that test is with your colleagues, not just necessarily with students. I like Patrick, you're talking there about students from all over the States in Australia and maybe even different countries. So you need to make sure that legislation does meet those particular locations. Don't forget when you're issuing a qualification for a student in Australia that we're talking about meeting local legislation. But certainly there will be other legislation that people have to meet. But generally within a unit of competency or qualification, it talks about the legislation which is applicable to Australia. Trial the tools, yeah. Kirsty, one-person RTO. What you're talking about there, I think you provide assessment tools such as the instructions, the matrix, the assessment observations. Yeah, you're picking out all of those things in the tool there and ensuring that reliability, of course. The interesting one, Lynette, check the instruments comes from a variety of mode, third-party observation questioning. I didn't mention third-party before, but third-party is definitely something that can be planned for. I know there are a range of assessments that you will conduct with a third-party, particularly if it's to do with work placement. Will be really important evidence that you're gathering and you're planning to gather that evidence. That third party may not make the judgment, you will make the judgment, but the third party tool is a really important one and needs to really let them know what they have to do.
John, Kirsty has also come back through with some more information towards the bottom, saying that she provides the tools to both ex-students to ensure they're relevant on the floor work, also, and people never in industry, to read the tools to make sure that they read well.
Yeah, good idea. If they're your clients, of course, who better than to trial them with? So it's a really good opportunity, Kirsty, and I like that. So these are ex-students. They can give you some value feedback about whether it makes sense to them, because often a question makes sense to us or an observation makes sense to us. But, you know, at the end of the day, you want it to be reliable. It has to make sense to them as well. I like that you often use your family as well. And if you've got a mother-in-law who is really great at editing, why wouldn't you use that? Yeah, they have to read well.
And John, overall, we've got quite a few people that have said mapping and validation processes as their main ways of doing this, and we've got a few mentions of LLN and foundation skills in there as well.
Yeah, good. I think the LLN, we're going to be looking at that unit in a couple of weeks' time, and I think that the LLN requirement at that particular stage is actually reinforced by things like Kirsty's statement as well, that we need to get that language right. We need to make sure that these assessments are legible and they're designed to be read by the people who are working at that level, that we're avoiding any certainly at a Cert 2 or Cert 3, we're avoiding anything which might sound too academic. We want these people to achieve. We want them to see that they are in a part of an academic program, but we want to also make sure that the language supports them. It doesn't in any way gets in the way of them understanding what's required. So it's not in any way saying it's above them or below them. It's just appropriate to that level. So that's good. Okay, let's have a look at the sort of things that I do then when I have a look at this. So one of the first things I look at is to see what sort of instruments I might need to develop. And you can see that there are basically 4 or 5 different styles. So am I going to use direct observation? Am I going to get people to actually supply? Am I going to ask them to supply products? Am I going to get them to go away and to do some risk assessment or to create a part of a strategic plan or an operational report? In other words, is their assignment to actually give me back a finished product that I will actually assess? That might be part of a portfolio, or I might be using questioning. And again, you can see how we were talking about third party, how that comes out here. Yeah, I do check the instrument for validity, reliability, fairness and flexibility. And determine if the dimensions of competency could be met. You know, there are 4 dimensions of competency, and one of the things that I always make sure is that within any unit of competency, so it may not necessarily be within one of the tools, but across a unit of competency, I have been able to see that dimensions of competency can be met. In other words, the task that the student will carry out can be observed or measured. The management of a number of tasks can be done. So often within the workplace, we're not just doing one thing. You know, if we're using tools, we're generally using tools to fabricate or to create in some way. So we're using more than one task at the same time. We need to manage that task. The dimension of competency to do with when things go wrong is that contingency. What happens when things go wrong? You know, I don't think my assessments are good assessments unless I'm asking students, what would you do if you didn't get this right? You know, if you went to do a pre-start check on a tractor, and when you got there you found you needed oil but there was no oil available, what would you do? I mean, it's a question you need to ask, and that meets that dimension of competency. And the final the 4th dimension of competency are people following the policies, the procedures, their responsibilities within the workplace. You know, my assessment instruments or the overall tools that I use won't be good unless I check them out. And then finally, will it actually gather the evidence that I want to collect? So, you know, this particular assessment, will it allow me to actually measure that it is authentic? What is it that it gets the student to do that provides evidence to me it's an authentic assessment? So, you know, is it sufficient, etc.? Will it gather evidence that will make it sufficient? So it's all about the potential to gather evidence to meet the rules of evidence. I would then put that into my profile, as you can see there, and then I would start to look at the last one, which again it's your turn to have a look at. I mentioned this one at the beginning, you know, when we talked about right at step number 1, where I identify the evidence requirements for the assessment tool. And right now, step number 6, what we're going to look at is how do we make sure that we version controlled it and it's the only one available. I don't know whether you've ever fallen into the trap of, you know, thinking you have the one which is the latest and the greatest, and then you find that it's actually not, that the version's been superseded. So, you know, what is it that you do start to chat in there. What do you do to apply version control procedures to make sure it is only the latest versions that are at the point of use? Just a couple of hints there. It might be that you only ever publish them electronically. But you tell me what it is that you do. So Karen, you come in there straight away with looking at using the RTO's conventions for version control. Really good. A whole range of different ways of doing that, but if you've got a convention that works based on revision number or whatever it might be, that's great. Use it. And Catherine, you're asking, what is it what you normally do? Yeah, you're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. You'll have lots of other documents that are version control. And maybe this particular assessment tool is version 2, or it's been revised on this particular date. So, yeah, you'll be using existing controls. A good one there from David. It's something that I think is really excellent to do. Only ever use an online approach where that's the only one that can be made available. So don't forget, you may still have to print this out, or if the students are looking at it from a distance, they may be using the online tool as well. Yeah, be diligent with the footers. People need to, it's almost a discipline we need to have with any trainer and assessor. Whenever I induct any trainer and assessor, one of the first things we look at, when you pick up the document, just make sure it's the latest version. Go down to the base, what's in the footer, compare that footer to the register that shows what the latest document is, and you know you're dealing with it. Yeah. So, yeah, John, you're talking about some routine review processes, which are good. I mean, a lot of people will make sure that, a lot of RTOs will make sure that they have a particular aspect of their internal review or their internal audit that just looks at documents and version control. It is so critical. We don't have time today for me to tell you stories of where I've seen the wrong documents used, and where, particularly within other quality systems outside of our training and education quality system, where the use of those other documents has literally cost the business thousands and thousands of dollars because the wrong version was used. Now, we may not have the same monetary situation, but we do have the intellectual situation. We need to be using the latest one. Yes, I can see a whole range of things here where people are starting to use their organization's management system. How it's quite clear that version control is there. Don't forget, one of the things also is to always make sure if you are dealing in hard copy, and there's still lots of RTOs where I would go to, and there's nothing wrong with their system where they'll open a folder and they will show me their latest version of that assessment. It will still have version control on it, and they will still check it to the master register to make sure it is the latest one. But don't forget, if you are issuing them as pieces of paper, just make sure you retrieve the old pieces. So what does Pricey look for when he's doing this? Exactly the same as what you said. We use organizational policies and procedures. These are not just for version control, but also for storage and retrieval, and making sure any previous versions are replaced by the current version. This is a discipline that goes beyond just our assessment tools. Often when I'm doing internal audits with people, I will find old copies of marketing materials, old copies of student handbooks, old copies of staff handbooks. So, again, it's a discipline. We're talking about this discipline for our assessment tools, but it's a discipline we use for managing most of the documents in our RTO. And that's why I'm pleased with the sorts of information you're putting through. Use your organizational policies. make sure we retrieve the old ones, replace them by the new ones, either electronically or in hard copy. And then we've got them ticked off. We're all done. We might all be done, but I think, if I look at it today, we've still got 10 minutes or so to answer any other questions you have. So please start to chat in with them. Particularly the 38% of you who hopefully are going to go forward with this and see if you can gather all this information and start to look at it to help you to do your RPL. And it's not discounting the 62% of you, of course, who will need to retain your currency in this particular area as well. So any questions at all that you may have?
John, I've got a question from earlier from David about the way that you've designed the performance, and he said on the summary of the unit that we're going through, that you've got in that first column, how has John decided the wording of the descriptions in the first column? Is it a reworking of unit performance criteria?
So that's where I use magic. It's where I use my magic mirror. So it's interesting, isn't it? It's a really good question. And it's not, this isn't an invitation by Pricey, but this is where I look at this unit, and to be honest with you, what I do when I look at this unit, the very first thing I look at is to say, what does a competent person do who can actually do this in the workplace? And that's where I get the summary from. So I developed the summary. David, it wasn't who asked the question. David, what I do is I develop this summary without, first of all, going to the unit. Because I do accept that units of competency don't necessarily stand alone within the workplace. So I look at this and I say, what does a competent person do that can design and develop assessment tools? And what I'll then do is I'll start to scratch these, in this particular case, 6 things down. So I look at myself and say, what do I do when I'm doing this? So that's the genesis of this. That's how I started out. And then what I do, David, I then go and have a look at and if you have a look at the unit, you will see that the elements help me to get this right. The application helps me to get it right. The evidence requirements help me to get it right. So I then put it together as this set of statements, and then what I do to make sure I feel comfortable with it, I then map it against those requirements. This is a process I've used for many years now. And what it then does is really help me, particularly if I was RPLing you in this. Can you imagine now if I've created it this way? Maybe the very first, have a look at summary number 1, identify the evidence requirements for the assessment tools. And what I would do is I would say to you, if you were an RPO candidate, David, can you tell me, how do you identify the evidence requirements for the assessment tools that you make? And that then allows me to be able to then relate to what you do in a practical situation. And of course, the answers to that will be my benchmarks that I've created. And you know what? They won't be very far from the activities that we've all created today. So there is magic in this, but it's to do with the magic mirror. Have a look at yourself in that mirror. See if you can see a competent person and start to put this summary together based on what a competent person looks like, and then go to the unit to confirm it. I obviously never ignore the unit. The unit becomes the foundation. But I'll start from the workplace, then I'll make sure the unit maps up to it.
And John, David's just written in, we should get you to redesign some of the units of competence. Your approach makes sense.
David, if it's almost like you're a mind reader there, mate, because I think personally that once we've now moved to the new units of competency, we're actually getting closer with the performance evidence statements to this approach. So, you see as we've gone from the older versions to the new version, we've got performance evidence and knowledge evidence. In some way, it's getting close to this, but, the discipline for me is, what does this look like in the workplace? And you're right, maybe in some future iteration, I'll be retiring probably in the next 40 years. I'll be 111 or 112 or something. I wonder what it'll look like then. David, you might be right. It might look like this in some way.
That's when we look at that other photo you showed us last week with the big beard.
The beard. In my 111th year of age.
John, we've got a question from Jennifer. Could the assessments prepared for TAEASS502 evidence be used as evidence for this unit as well, such as assessments developed from an assessment pathway and recognition pathway?
Are you a mind reader? Because it's interesting, when I developed, some of you may or may not know, but one of the products I've developed recently, which is a product that the Valve sells, is the complete RPL kit for the TAE 40116. And when you look at that, one of the things that I did originally was to cluster those two units together. So when you look at those two units, you'll actually see there's a lot of similarities in them. And to answer your question probably in even a more practical way is that last week when we were looking at the 401 units, there'll be lots of activities that you did there, such as looking at units of competency and analysing them and looking at the context, that you'll find lots of those activities actually map across to this one as well. So well done. It's a really good picture you've got there, and certainly something that I've done. These two units, this one and the TAEASS502 unit, really do cluster well together.
And we've got a question from Stephen. What assessment processes do you recommend when there are language literacy and numeracy problems with the learner?
One of the greatest ways of assessing people with a language literacy and numeracy problem is that nearly always they've been able to cope in some way by doing practical things. So often I'll use an oral assessment. I'll ask them questions, I'll probe for some responses, I'll give lots of positive reinforcement as I'm doing that. And the probing is not giving them the answer. The probing is just listening for an answer, and maybe when I don't get the full answer, rephrasing the question. So when I'm dealing with people who do have language literacy and numeracy problems, those people generally may not be able to have read everything or numeracy requirements, but generally give them something practical to do. Observe them, talk to them. Use those techniques, and certainly if they do need, for whatever that qualification is, to be able to read, you have to make sure they can read as well. But just making sure that the reading that they do is not over the top, that it meets the requirements of whatever that unit is. So, I always think that most people are generally fairly practical in what they do, and that's how they've survived. So if you can replicate that in your assessment, it makes some sense.
We've got a few coming in, but we're sort of running a little bit short of time. There's one from John that says, do you allow some time separation between building an assessment and mapping, remapping, such as fresh eyes? Any recommendations for this process?
John, I've actually learned through the past, is that when I'm actually writing the assessment, I actually map it on the fly. To be honest with you, if I've written an assessment and then I go back to try and map it, I often can't find what I'm looking for, whereas if I start to, first of all, create this summary, because don't forget this summary that I've created here actually then starts to say to me, well, if this is a summary of the unit, what evidence do I need? And then I start to write the assessment, and as I'm looking for that assessment to come together, I actually start to map it on the fly. So that's where I generally work with the units of competency in front of me, and I'll be highlighting either manually or electronically. So I do it. Not everybody might do it that way, but I've found through experience that if I try and do it later, I don't get as good a result if I've done it on the fly. So that's the way I do it.
John, we'll finish up with one. We've got a few comments coming in about the actual unit of competency and the requirements here. And I've just had a look there, and we just want to confirm how many assessment tools and how much they need to address.
Okay, you know what I may have done here? That's good, and that's where the information has to come from. So if anything, you look at it positively and think price is going over a little bit here. I think what I've done is when I put it together and combined this particular unit with one of the other units, I've left those 5 in there. So you can see there's a chance to double dip in that. So you're right, it should be 3. And whoever asked the question, still has to address at least 1 unit of competency. So so that's I was getting you to do too much there. So there's, if anything, it's better than better than having it over than having it under. Yeah, I think, Kerry, what I've done there is when I've clustered that, I've left those other 2 in there. So my apologies for that.
Yep. So I'll just read out that line from the unit of competency. So the assessment requirements say that you need to develop at least 3 assessment tools that support different assessment methods and address at least 1 unit of competency each. And there's more information there about that in the rest of the dot points there. So just wanted to clarify that information.
What we might do is that when I go through all the questions that people have asked, just to make sure that they're on track with what they're getting, I might just copy and paste that into that unit, into that document, so that people can see that it is. Yep. So anything else coming through, or do we then still, as we normally do, pick up the questions a bit later?
Yeah, we've got another 3 minutes, so I might just throw another one at you.
Yeah, good.
Is it possible to use a combination of assessments when assessing a student? This comes from Patrick. E.g., start with a written assessment relating to underpinning knowledge, and when marking, you determine the student needs to add more information. So can you gather this additional information by way of using an RPL question to broaden the student's response to the question? So combining a number of assessment methods.
Couple of answers to that. The answer is that we're always trying to get the best from the students. So often when we probe, we may probe by asking some extra questions. But nearly always what you're doing, you're probing for an answer that you've already got written down. So if I ask a question and I don't get the full answer, when I probe, I actually don't have to write that probing question down. All I'm doing is looking for the answer for the first question I asked. The other point to consider is that prior to conducting any assessment, you should have at least planned all of the assessment tools that you're going to use. So this particular unit of competency requires 3 assessment tools. They would have been developed before the unit is actually assessed. So you're not building assessments as you go along. But what I will do, and particularly you can imagine in an observation, what I'll try and do in an observation, although the observation is an assessment where I'm observing the student doing something, I'll drop in some questions in the planned questions that are part of the observation. So often I'll have these hybrid type of assessments, which is an observation, but it's got 2 or 3 questions in there, which are mostly of those what would you do if type questions that are structured and they are planned to happen beforehand. Again, when we do our validation of assessment, that's when we find whether we've got any gaps in assessment, and that's when we'll review our assessment tools and we'll make those changes. But the whole principle is that when I'm conducting an assessment, I should have already developed these assessment tools. I may have to probe and change them on the fly, but generally I'm not building them as I'm going along. When I go into assessment, all the tools are already there. I think that's probably as much as we're going to get through today. And I'm going to hand back over to Brittany now to thank you on her behalf, but certainly thank you from my behalf. It's good to catch up with you. Next week we're going to be looking at other activities that we could consider would have been the activities that are on your screen now. So we did have a whole set of things that we could also use to actually support our currency. And when we come together next week, we're going to go on to probably one of the best controlling aspects of this, which is the assessment validation. So in that assessment validation is when we really do make sure that we've got the quality right. It is a review process, but it helps us build the quality into certainly the next time we do it. So over to you, Brittany.
Thank you so much for that, John. There was a lot of content covered there, and there are some great questions coming through. So what happens now? Within 48 hours, you'll receive an email including your statement of attendance, a link to the event feedback survey, access to the recording of the webinar, as well as a PDF copy of the PowerPoint and the chat Q&A. And we'll have any further questions that were asked will be answered by John in the resources that come out. So if you do have any further questions, please feel free to keep them coming in. If not, feel free to log off. And I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you all online next week. Thanks, everyone.